They say self-awareness is a strength, that the ability to reflect on yourself, to question your behavior, to consider how your actions affect others, is a sign of emotional maturity. And in many ways, that is true. But there is another side to self-awareness that people rarely talk about, because sometimes the person who reflects the most is also the one who blames themselves for everything. When a conversation ends awkwardly, you assume you said something wrong. When someone becomes quiet, your mind searches for the moment you must have misstepped. When tension enters the room, you don't wait for explanations. Your thoughts have already turned inward. What did I do? For some people, this reaction becomes automatic, not because they are arrogant, not because they believe everything revolves around them, but because somewhere along the way, responsibility began to feel safer than uncertainty. And over time, this quiet habit shapes the way they understand relationships, conflict, and even themselves. Today, we're exploring the psychology of people who assume they're the problem, and what this pattern quietly reveals about empathy, emotional responsibility, and the hidden weight some people carry. Let's begin. The reflex of self-blame. For some people, self-blame is not a conscious decision. It is a reflex. Something small shifts in a conversation. A pause that feels slightly too long, a message that sounds shorter than usual, a subtle change in someone's tone, and almost immediately the mind begins searching for a cause. But instead of scanning the entire situation, the search moves inward first. Did I say something wrong? You replay the moment, your words, your expression, your timing. Most people occasionally reflect like this, but for someone who has developed the habit of self-blame, the investigation goes deeper. Even if there is no clear evidence that you caused the tension, the possibility alone is enough to trigger doubt. Psychologists sometimes describe this pattern as internal attribution bias, the tendency to assume responsibility for negative outcomes. But emotionally, it rarely feels like bias. It feels like caution, because if you were the cause, at least the situation makes sense. And if you understand the cause, maybe you can prevent it next time. But when this reflex becomes constant, something subtle begins to happen. Responsibility flows inward by default. Even in situations where many factors are involved, stress, misunderstanding, someone else's mood, you remain the first suspect, the childhood of emotional guesswork. To understand where this reflex begins, we often have to look much earlier. Children are extremely sensitive to emotional environments. They notice changes in tone, shifts in facial expressions, the silence that follows tension. In calm households, emotions are usually predictable, but in less stable environments, children learn a different skill. They learn to monitor emotional stability. If a parent seems upset, the child wonders what caused it. If conflict appears suddenly, they search for ways to calm the situation. Because children naturally see themselves as central to their environment, they often reach a quiet conclusion. Maybe I did something wrong. This belief may not be spoken aloud, but the nervous system begins learning a rule. If the environment becomes tense, look inward first. Over time, this becomes a coping strategy. If you assume responsibility, you gain a sense of control. And control feels safer than confusion. But what begins as adaptation in childhood can become a lasting pattern in adulthood, long after the original environment has disappeared. The brain's pattern of over-responsibility. The human brain is designed to detect patterns. When something happens repeatedly, the brain begins predicting it. If emotional tension frequently followed your actions earlier in life, your mind learns to expect that pattern again. So when something feels uncomfortable, the brain runs a familiar script. What did I do? This becomes a mental shortcut. Instead of analyzing the entire situation, the mind moves directly towards self-evaluation. People who develop this pattern are often highly empathetic. They are skilled at reading emotional signals. But empathy without boundaries can create a difficult dynamic, because the more aware you are of other people's feelings, the easier it becomes to assume that you caused them, even when those emotions have nothing to do with you. The invisible burden of emotional labor. In many relationships, the person who assumes they're the problem also becomes the one who manages emotional balance. They notice tension early, they soften disagreements, they carefully choose their words. From the outside, this can look like kindness and emotional intelligence, and often it is.
But beneath that attentiveness may live a quiet responsibility. The feeling that the stability of the relationship depends on your ability to manage yourself perfectly. If someone feels upset, you try to fix it. If conflict appears, you search for the mistake you made. Slowly, without realizing it, you become responsible for emotional harmony. And that responsibility can become exhausting. Because relationships are not meant to be regulated by one person alone. The fear of being too much. Underneath chronic self-blame often lies a deeper fear. Not that you are a bad person, but that you might be too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too complicated. So you begin adjusting yourself in small ways. You speak less. You apologize more. You minimize your needs, because if you reduce your impact on others, maybe fewer problems will appear. But shrinking yourself has a cost, because the more you minimize your presence, the harder it becomes to recognize your own needs. Why sensitive people blame themselves? People who blame themselves frequently are often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like insecurity, but in many cases, it comes from empathy. These individuals care deeply about how their actions affect others. They want to avoid causing harm. And because they are so attentive to emotional nuance, they monitor themselves carefully, sometimes too carefully. What appears to be self-criticism is often an attempt to be considerate. But without balance, empathy can turn inward. And instead of sharing responsibility for conflict, the person absorbs it entirely. When self-awareness becomes self-erosion. Self-awareness is valuable. It allows growth, reflection, and accountability. But when reflection becomes constant self-interrogation, something begins to change. Instead of asking, "What happened here?" the mind asks, "What is wrong with me?" Over time, self-awareness becomes self-doubt. You question your reactions. You question your tone. You question your intentions. Eventually, the mind stops trusting itself, and what began as reflection slowly erodes confidence. Learning that not everything is yours to carry. There is a realization many people reach slowly. Not every silence was about you. Not every tension was your fault. Not every emotional shift requires explanation. Sometimes people are simply tired. Sometimes misunderstandings occur. Sometimes emotions change for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Recognizing this does not mean avoiding responsibility. It simply means recognizing that responsibility is shared. If this pattern feels familiar to you, it does not mean something is wrong with you. Often, it means you learn to care deeply about the emotional impact you have on others. But caring deeply does not mean carrying everything. Not every silence needs explanation. Not every conflict requires self-correction. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is allow uncertainty to exist without assuming blame. And if this reflection resonated with you, you are not alone. Many thoughtful and empathetic people share this quiet habit. But habits can be understood, and what can be understood can slowly begin to change. Thank you for watching.